This is the second largest grouper species in the entire world. Second only to the Goliath grouper, which we're not legally allowed to harvest. So this is the largest grouper that we can legally harvest. Even though this is the second largest grouper species in the entire world, this one isn't even close to the biggest. This is a 154-pound Warsaw grouper, and these fish get over 500 pounds. So if you were ever curious what the meat looks like on a 154-pound grouper, you're about to find out. You've got a collarbone right here. Dip your knife right underneath, and then you're gonna outline that collarbone as you go down underneath this fin right here, which is his pelvic fin. Then we're gonna flip our knife around and start cutting behind the head. Now, all grouper have a good chunk of meat that go behind the head, and it's safe to assume the larger they are, the more meat they have behind the head, and that is accurate. Now that we have this initial opening, we're gonna flip our knife around and have the blade facing outward as we push in, making a nice outline. Just use the tip of your knife just while we're making that initial outline. As you can imagine, the skin on this grouper is incredibly thick. Look at this. That is absolutely insane. What a phenomenal creature. All right, now we just keep using the tip of our knife to slide down, make a nice opening right on top of that dorsal fin. And just like that, we've got a nice opening to work with. We're gonna use the full body of our blade now to get into the fillet. We wanna make sure that we're right on top of that backbone, not underneath that backbone. That way we're not missing out on any of this gorgeous Warsaw grouper meat. Giant groupers like Warsaw have a reputation for not having the best meat. A lot of people think that the bigger the grouper is, the tougher, chewier, rubbery it is. And the problem with people thinking that about these giant grouper is there's people out there catching them, and these are really deep water fish. So if you're pulling a fish out of 1,000 feet of water, it's not gonna survive going back down. So you already killed the animal. So it's really important that I get to show you guys not only that it's actually a delicious fish, but how to cut it properly so that way you have the best experience possible. That way none of this wonderful animal gets wasted. We're now getting the meat that's behind the head, and there's a bone that sticks out right here. I want to just kind of outline that bone and go around it and push the meat off of it. So you can see how I'm sticking out right here. That is just to go around that bone. And we got all the meat behind the head. Now we're resting our knife right on that backbone, having our knife at a slight angle downward. That way we're not missing out on any of that meat as we work our way to the center spine. We're gonna use just the tip of our knife to go to the top of the center spine. That way, it's not pulling on the meat as we lift on it. After we go all the way down, and then we worked our way to the top of the spine along the entire length of the fish, we're now gonna get to the point where we separate the connection the pin bones make to the ribs. Put the tip of our knife at the base of the ribs, angle our knife slightly up, we separate the connection the pin bones make to the ribs, and this is the spine we went to the top of. And you can see how the meat is being pulled on right here. If we didn't work our way all the way to the top, the point to where that's being pulled on would be higher up and be tearing into the center of our hyoid, which is some of the most prized part of the fish. We don't want that. Now we're gonna dip our knife on the other side of that spine and slide down at an angle. Now we're gonna rest our knife right on top of these rib bones and start sliding down the ribs. The rib bones in this fish are a little stronger than a lot of other fish, so you can apply a little bit more pressure to them, making sure that you scrape all the meat off the top of those rib bones. Once you get to the bottom of the ribs, you can cut straight down and leave all that belly meat on the fillet. Look how good the meat looks. This is a 154-pound Warsaw grouper. That meat is snow white. Speaking of snow white, this fish commonly gets mistaken for a snowy grouper, or vice versa. And how you can tell the difference between a large snowy grouper and a Warsaw grouper, well, snowy grouper don't get this big. But in the 30 to 40 pound range, a snowy grouper and a Warsaw grouper look very similar to each other because snowy grouper lose their spots as they get bigger. But a tell sign of the difference between a snowy and a Warsaw is the second dorsal spine on a Warsaw is massive. Totally different than a snowy. And a Warsaw has 10 when a snowy has 11. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this last one right here on a snowy would be the 11th. All right, now that we're at this point, all we gotta do is separate off the rest of the fish. We're gonna puncture straight through. Running a seafood market has me insanely busy, and that's to say the least. That's where today's sponsor comes in, Factor. Factor makes fresh, never frozen meals for a busy lifestyle. With an expanded menu, Factor makes accomplishing your wellness goals easy. They have a huge menu with 80+ rotating weekly meals. These meals are chef crafted and restaurant quality. Factor now has a new meal customization option that allows you to swap select proteins at no additional cost. Love chicken but hate pork? Swap them for free. Factor also has gluten-free options and just launched new Asian and Mediterranean meals. Factor allows you to stay on track with wellness-forward meals made with whole food ingredients, no refined seed oils, no refined sugars, just real food from Factor. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Fishmonger FB50 to get 50% off plus breakfast for 1 whole year. Again, that's code Fishmonger FB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. Look, the thickness of this skin is absolutely insane. This knife is sharp and this skin gives it a run for its money. And look at the way the scales layer. That is so cool. Look at that, holy smokes. Now, fish is so much more than just 2 fillets. And the larger the fish is, the more you get to play with the different parts of the animal and see the different tastes and textures of the different pieces. What I mean by that is you can see the natural separation from the outside of the high loin, from the eye of the high loin. And this piece, kind of like a backstrap, is gonna have a different texture than the tenderloin to the center of the eye. Then this eye will travel down like this. So this bloodline is the mark of the high loin. This line all the way up is the mark of where the eye is. So the eye runs down like this. So you have the outside, the center, which is more like a tenderloin, and then the inside. And each one of those is gonna have a slightly different texture and fat content, very similar to beef. Well, it's not gonna taste like beef, but there's different cuts like beef. All right, now we're gonna take out the wing. We're gonna take out the entire collar portion. We're gonna lift up the gills like this. We're gonna puncture the membrane right underneath the gills and slide straight to the throat. We're not gonna slide all the way up, because as you guys might know, I really like this cut of meat and I don't wanna cut through it while I'm cutting those collars out. All right, so after you puncture the membrane and slide to the bottom here, we're gonna slide right underneath this bone. So you guys can see that this bone right here is resting on top of the collarbone. You can see this little ledge. We're gonna slide our knife right underneath that ledge. That way we're not cutting through any bone to remove the collar. Once you cut underneath that all the way, you can feel where the top of the collarbone is. Right here, we're gonna slide our knife right underneath that. Again, not cutting through any bones. All right, as you guys can see, there's just this little bit of membrane right here holding it together. Cut through that, and this whole wing is going to release. So you roll it over, there is a large bone that is going to be holding onto this that is right underneath the throat. And we can just slide our knife right underneath that large bone. And just like that, oh, got a giant dinosaur wing right here. Now we're just gonna trim up some of this membrane off of it. On smaller fish, this membrane just kind of melts away and you don't have to worry about trimming it up too much. On larger fish, you want to trim off as much as you can because it could be a little tougher. And there's multiple different cuts of meat on a wing portion. A lot of people call wings collars, and they're not entirely wrong. There's collar in the wing, and kind of like a chicken wing. So you have 3 different components on that chicken wing, and very similar to this, though, you know, dinosaur size. So on this massive wing, you've got the meat that is right on top of this pelvic fin. We're gonna have collar meat. Then you can see the texture of the meat right here changes right here. This meat right here is the pec fin meat. This is the pectoral fin, and this is the meat or the muscle that controls that fin, and it's delicious. Then the meat right here, you can see this line right there. you can kind of see how there's a circle around that pec fin meat. Then, right on the other side of that circle, this is the meat that is going underneath the throat. So this is actually the grouper throat, pec fin meat, and collar meat. That's one of the really fun things about cooking wing portions is you get 3 different cuts in one, and you get to experience 3 different cuts in one, which is awesome. This is so cool, dude. I love this. This is fun. Now there's 2 different approaches to go after the rib meat on a big grouper. You can go for a boneless cut or a bone-in cut. For a bone-in cut, we would go for the base and cut right through it. Then we would trim the membrane off the back. That's awesome, but this fish is so big. I'm gonna show you guys how to do the boneless portion. We're gonna take our knife and slide right underneath each rib, just like that. Find the tip, slide your knife right underneath, get as close to that bone as possible. You see that white line? That means you're close to that bone and you're missing out on as little meat as possible. Slide your knife right underneath and slide forward, just like that. And I'm holding my hand right underneath each bone. That way it flops over, so that way I'm not cutting into the meat. Here is the last rib bone right here. We're going to just make a little incision right in front of that. Now I'm gonna dip my knife in, angled towards the base. That way I can cut through all that membrane that's holding it together and slide it out just like that. And you have got a massive rack of boneless Warsaw grouper ribs. Now it does have membrane on one side and we're gonna cut that out. So just like skinning, start at a harder angle and wedge our knife down. Once our knife is on top of that membrane, we're gonna flatten it out. That way we can slide forward just like that, and then da-da-da-da, look how good that rib meat looks. Got a little bit of membrane still in there. We're gonna gently trim that out. Now that is ready for the pan. All right, now we're gonna see how big a cheek is on a 154-pound Warsaw grouper. Find where the soft meets the hard. Puncture our knife right at that line and start to outline. Once we can lift up on that skin a little bit, makes it a little bit easier to make sure that we're outlining that bone. Right here is the bone. So now that it's exposed, we're using this part of our knife to outline it. As long as you feel that bone with your knife, you're not missing out on any of the meat. If you don't feel the bone with your knife, make an adjustment. You have a chunk of meat underneath this lip. On Warsaws, their lips are forward more, and it's actually easier to get to. There is a ledge right here of a bone on top of the lip right here, and there is meat that is inside of that pocket. That is probably the hardest part of the cheek meat to get to, and you wanna just outline top of that lip until you get to it, so you can see the meat goes all the way in. And just like on smaller groupers, you can put your finger underneath it and give it a nice little tug and lift it out just like that. Now, we're gonna take our knife and just make a nice smooth motion just like that, separating off the membrane that is holding onto the skin on that cheek. So we're gonna peel the cheek off, then we're gonna have to cut it off of this membrane. And boom, that is an absolute massive cheek. Before we weigh this massive fillet, I'm gonna trim it up a little bit, take off all the non-sellable stuff. All right, now that we've got the belly all trimmed up, we're gonna see what this massive Warsaw grouper fillet weighs out to. 36.22. So if we factor in the other side, we'd be at 72.44, almost 72.5 pounds. This is 154 pounds. That is about a 45% yield, and that's not bad for a fish of this size. All right, now we're gonna weigh up this massive dinosaur wing, and then we're gonna weigh the ribs and the cheek. We're at negative 3.71 from the tear we just had. So we're just gonna hit tear again, bring it back to 0, and 7.09 pounds, just over 7 pounds. And more than 50% of this is meat. That means you have 3.5 pounds of meat in this collar alone. 3.5 pounds at 8 ounces a person feeds 7 adults. And those collars are often discarded. Can you imagine a collar that can feed 7 adults getting discarded? And there's 2 on each fish. We've got 8-ounce portions for 14 adults in the collars alone. Now we're gonna check out this boneless rib meat. 0.77. That is just over 3/4 of a pound. That is either one meal for a very large eater or 2 6-ounce portions, which is more realistic. I'm so curious the weight of this cheek. 1.25 pounds in one single cheek. That means both cheeks are 2.5 pounds. 2.5 pounds feeds 5 adults. All right, now I'm gonna show you guys how to cut up this massive Warsaw grouper to where it's not tough at all. This fish being tough is just a myth, and it's from not being portioned out properly to make it more tender. Kind of like meat, if you don't cut it right, it's gonna be tougher. And if you cut it right, it's gonna be more tender. We're gonna show you guys how to cut it right. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna separate the high loin from the low loin. That's easy. All you have to do is follow that bloodline all the way to the front. And at the top of that bloodline, between the two loins, is going to be a pin bone line. On grouper, the pin bone line at the top hooks towards the high loin. So we're gonna go right next to those pin bones, then do a little curve to get back to that bloodline as we separate out the low loin from the high. Once we cut through the meat to the skin, we're gonna take our knife and make a little incision into that skin. It makes a perforated edge, and then you get a grip on one of the loins and you pull away as you make these cuts. All right, now we're at the pin bones. They're hooking under the high loin a little bit, so we have to angle our knife as we get to these top bones. If you notice that the meat is over here, whereas the skin is down here, that's because we're following the pin bone line. And there you go. We left all the pin bones in the low loin. So our next step is to come back, and we're going to take out some of that bloodline, which isn't actually blood, it's myoglobin rich meat, but that is a conversation for another day. All right, we got bloodline and pin bone line. Now we're ready to portion. So you see these lines right here? That is the meat that was on top of the rib bones. Those lines look just like that rib portion we cut out. That's because that's the bottom of those ribs. And you can see they end right here. That's where the rib bone ends and the belly begins. So this is the belly and this is the top of the rib. We're going to turn those into two separate portions because they have different tastes and textures. So here's the last rib bone line. We're gonna go right in front of that last rib bone line and cut down at an angle, just like that. Now we have the low loin separated from the top of the rib meat and the belly. Now we're gonna cut down just like that and separate these two portions off the skin. On this fish, you can put as much pressure down on that skin as you want and you're not gonna cut through it, I promise. Here's the top of the ribs, here's the bottom of the ribs, similar to other animals, and they are going to be slightly different from each other, but they are going to be pretty similar. Flip this around. When skinning, you want to angle your knife slightly down and make a nice, long, smooth motion just like that. That way you're not losing out on any of that delicious meat. And there's our boneless, skinless belly meat. Now, on Warsaw grouper, snowy grouper, and yellow edge grouper, the deeper water members of the grouper family, the belly meat actually isn't super fatty. It is gonna have a great texture to it. It's gonna be mild and delicious. It's not gonna be flaky like a snapper, but you can see these lines running through it going this way. It makes for a very unique texture, absolutely delicious, but it's not gonna be fatty like the belly of a black grouper or a gray grouper. These white lines right here are called sinew. Sinew is a fiber that runs through the meat of the fish that has a little bit of a chewy texture to it. Now that sinew has the ability to create a tougher texture in a larger fish because as the fish grows, the sinew gets a little bit thicker and tougher. So people aren't wrong that bigger fish are tougher. You just have to cut it slightly differently to combat that. Sinew melts away in a strong high heat. So if you cut it where the sinew is exposed and a little bit thinner to where the meat is hitting the high heat, it's gonna melt away and it's gonna be nice and tender. I'm gonna show you. Where this fish naturally wants to separate in the high loin is where we're going to let it separate. And you can see, kind of like beef, it has these fibers that are holding onto it that you can just kind of pull away. And it is showing you where the portion is all on its own. We're gonna follow that down all the way, just like that. All right. So we've got the center of the high loin, which is kind of like the prize of the fish to a lot of people. It's gonna be the most tender, but on a fish this big, those sinew lines get thicker. So we're gonna square off the front, just like that. Now you can see the sinew lines exposed. And if we cut them at about 1 inch thick, just like that, go down, making these beautiful medallions. You can then cut them right off the skin, and look how good these look. These are nice and flat and thin enough to where whether you're doing the pan or a grill, which that's my recommendation, I would stay away from the oven for larger fish like this, with the exception of the wings. The wing roasted with the bone in. The bone holds in all that moisture. You can cook it extra to make it more tender, even though it's got all those bones in there. So wing, great in the oven. These, I'd go just pan or grill and have a nice high heat, and those sinew lines are going to melt in that high heat, making it more tender. All right, now we're gonna cut off the head, put the body in our walk-in refrigerator, and bury it under ice. There's no way we're gonna be able to sell both sides of this massive fish in our retail shop in one day, so we only wanna put out same-day cut fish. That way it's as premium as possible for our customers. After we chop off the head, there's still so much good meat left inside of this head. There's still a lot of good meat left in that skeleton that we're not gonna let go to waste either. One of my favorite cuts on a head is this piece right here, that throat meat. We're going to slide our knife right underneath both sides, and we're gonna outline the tongue. It's a slippery cut. It's really hard to get a good grip on, so when you're cutting this out of your own fish, be careful not to cut yourself. It is slippery. Puncture through that membrane, slide out. Now we've got half of it released, and my knife is scraping on that tongue, and boom. This is like fish bacon. So good. As you can see, fish are so much more than just 2 fillets. The more we use, the less we need to take. Have a killer day, y'all.